Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Shmitria Rout Banks, the Rowdy Math teacher, and this is part 5 of my 7-part summer blog series focused on formative assessments. So far, we've talked about 3 of the 5 techniques that are introduced in the book, The Formative 5. The first technique was observations. The second technique was interviews, and the third technique was something called a show me response. Today, I'd like to introduce the fourth technique called a Hinge question. So what is a Hinge question? The book states that a Hinge question provides a check for understanding or proficiency at a particular hinge point in a lesson. We might think of this as that place in the lesson where, in order for students to be successful or to show mastery of a skill, they have to understand a particular point, or they have to have a particular piece of information. So we can think of it as success really hinging on them being able to successfully respond to a question that illustrates their thinking and understanding about a topic or a skill. Hinge questions can be used at a variety of points in your lesson. You may want to use it at the end of the lesson to help you decide, where do I go tomorrow? How do I direct my next lesson? So it could be used at the end of the lesson. It could be used in the middle of the lesson to determine whether or not you even need to continue with kind of the trajectory that you're on. And in fact, I will do an example of that today with a Hinge question. You may use a Hinge question at the beginning of your lesson to decide whether some interventions are needed, to decide whether you need to continue with what you had planned that day, or to decide whether you need to maybe give a challenge or kind of amp up what you are planning to use with your student. So Hinge questions can be used at a variety of places in your lesson, just depending on how you're planning to use the responses and what you're planning to do with that information. Also, Hinge questions can be used with the whole class and kind of as a diagnostic tool to get a better understanding of what your students understand about a topic. Or you may choose to use a Hinge question with a small group to assess where they are and whether further intervention or whether more challenge and extensions are needed. So how do we get started with Hinge questions? You guessed it, we're going to plan for it. Just like in the previous 3 techniques, the first thing that we're going to do is make a plan for how to use this particular technique as a formative assessment tool in the classroom. So first question for you to consider when you're planning is, how will you use Hinge questions to assess student understanding? So here's where we think about whether it's going to fit at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end of our lesson. We also want to consider what type of question will we ask. Will we ask a multiple choice formatted question and ask for clarification and additional information after the initial response? Or are we going to use more of an open-ended question where students will have a variety of ways that they format their answer? Second question, how will you use the responses you receive? And this is where we think about, what do we do with this information? Am I going to take this and use it to decide on tomorrow's lesson? Am I going to take this and decide whether or not I need to do some review work? Am I going to decide that I need to pull a small group? Or am I going to decide that I need to give maybe some more practice on that particular component of the lesson, especially if I kind of stopped in the middle of the lesson and said, hey, I need this information before I go on. So I want to decide how I'm going to use the responses. The third question, how will students respond to the Hinge question? So I want to decide now, am I going to have them use like a response card where maybe they have an A, B, C, or D. So they're just holding up a card to indicate their answer. Am I going to give them a whiteboard, and are they going to write their answer on the whiteboard and hold that up for me to see? This is where I want to decide, how are they going to respond to this question. Question number 4. What type of Hinge question will you use? In this part, we're thinking about really the type of question that we're asking. And NCTM's Principles to Action, which is a very popular book, and one that I would say is a staple for any math teacher to kind of have on your shelf as a reference tool, identifies 4 different types of questions. And I'll talk about them now. The first type of question is one where you're just trying to gather information. You want to just see if students can recall something. The next type of question is a probing their thinking, where you're really trying to investigate how they're thinking about something, and you're listening to their communication to determine what their processes are and what their thinking patterns are. How are they breaking down and understanding a question? The third type is a question that makes mathematics visible. And so we want to think about questions that make connections to ideas and show relationships amongst mathematical content and skills. The fourth type of question is one that encourages reflection and justification. So maybe those kind of follow-up questions where students really think about their reasoning and their actions, or maybe process how their response is reasonable. But this is where they're really reflecting and thinking about how they responded to a question. Question number 5. How might students respond to the Hinge question? And so, like in the other 3 parts, we want to think about what we might hear, what we might see. And again, thinking about that in advance helps us process how we're going to then respond and follow up to what we receive from students. Let's look at an example. I've used this planning tool to help me plan for a Hinge question to use with that same standard that I've kind of used as an example in the previous 3 parts of this series. So it's that solving real world problems using division of fractions. And so here's the question that I'm going to ask, or that I'm going to pose. Izzy's ice cream shop uses 1/4 of a cup of ice cream and 4 cookies to make 2 ice cream sandwiches. If each sandwich has the same amount of ice cream, write an expression to show how to determine how much ice cream is in each sandwich. Be prepared to justify your thinking. So the next piece of this, when am I going to ask this question? I'm going to ask this question in the middle of the lesson, because it really is important to know whether or not students can match an expression to the problem. Because if they can't do that, we really can't move on. If they can't match an expression to a real world situation, then they can't use a model, they can't move forward. And so this is really assessing that very first breakout that I kind of talked about in those previous 3 videos about whether or not they can determine the dividend and the divisor in the problem. So this is really assessing that piece. The second little chunk there says, will the question be used with the whole class or a small group? And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use it with the whole class. And then how will the question be formatted? I want to have the students give me a short answer. Their answer is actually, in this case, I've said, I want you to write an expression. So I'm not actually expecting them to answer the question. I really just want that first part. I just want the expression. The next part of the planning guide says, how will you use the responses you receive? And I've indicated there that I'm going to use those responses to determine whether the class is ready to move on to the next chunk, which would really be then using a model to illustrate the answer, or if I need to spend more time helping students determine how to decide which quantity is the dividend and which quantity is the divisor. And I've even kind of given an activity idea there. As I was thinking about this, I thought, well, if they're having trouble with it, or need more practice, and probably if they're just needing more practice, I could use some activity cards where they're matching an expression to a story problem. And with that, I'd want to make sure that I had story problems that had the same quantities, but used differently. Like sometimes it's the dividend, sometimes it's the divisor, so that students can't just match numbers. And it's sad to say, but we all know that students sometimes do that. They take the easy way out. If a student, though, is really struggling with how to decide, I probably would need to do a more intensive intervention and maybe pull them into a small group. And that's where I can note kind of what I'm planning. What am I planning to do with that information? The next part of the planning guide says, how will students respond to the Hinge question? In this case, I've decided to have them use a whiteboard. So they're just going to write their expression on the whiteboard. They'll hold it up. And then I'd like to probe a sampling of the students to make sure that their thinking matches their expression. Because sometimes students will write one expression and I'll ask them to talk to me about how they came up with that expression or how that expression matches the problem, and then the thinking that they reveal doesn't actually match what they wrote. So I want to just do a quick sampling of some of the students to make sure that they have their thinking matches their expression. Now I could also use this as somewhat of a multiple choice where we just have the two choices, A and B. And in this case, I actually could maybe have a little more. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But I could do an A and a B, and then maybe probe some of the students specifically who have the incorrect one to see what their thinking is and whether or not they actually don't understand or they just mix up their placement. The next part says, what type of Hinge question will you use? And that's where I talked about a few minutes ago. What type of question is it? And this is really a making math visible question because they're taking that story problem and they're having to translate the math there into an expression to illustrate the action of the problem. And then finally, how might students respond to the Hinge question? So here's how I'm thinking students will respond. Of course, I will have students that have the correct expression, and students that don't will typically have the two quantities reversed. That's certainly a response I'm expecting to see. And then some of the student responses may not match what they recorded on their whiteboard, and so that's also something I want to investigate. And I want to think about, are they just not knowing the order of a division problem? Do they know what to do and how to represent the problem in words, but they don't know how to get their thinking to match the expression? And that's a different problem than not knowing which is which. And then finally, for this particular problem, I may actually have students who pull that 4 out. And again, that's a different problem to address if they're not even sure which quantities they need to represent the problem. So if they pull that 4 out, then I know we've got a different issue. So those are some responses that I might expect to receive from this Hinge question. So what's next? At this point, I've really done the big chunk of the work. So I've planned this out. I know how I'm going to use it. I know how I'm going to respond because I already know what responses I expect. So the next piece would be for me to implement this in the classroom in my lesson and then take action on the responses that I receive. It's really that simple. And that's it for Hinge questions. I'd like to invite you to check out thewritingmathteacher.com for a free Hinge question planning freebie, very similar to the one that I used as the example earlier in the video. It's a great way to plan out exactly how you're going to use the question and anticipate student responses and think about how you're going to use those responses to either provide interventions or help move your students forward. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.